Oh, we get to see everybody.
That's the fun part.
Put my glasses
Hello,
on.
everybody, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 104th New Social Environment. I'm Sophia Pedlow, your MC today for a conversation between Joan Jonas and Daisy Desrosiers. Poet Stacy Simazak will read to close our session. And now to introduce today's hosts. Daisy Desrosiers is the inaugural Director of Artist Programs at the Lunar Institute for American Art at Colby College. She is an interdisciplinary art historian and independent curator. Her thesis concerns the cultural, post-colonial, and material implications of the use of sugar in contemporary art. She was the guest critic for the Brooklyn Rail May 2020 issue, where she addresses an array of artists, thinkers, and writers, translation and mistranslation as a creative, critical, and reflective process. We're so honored to have you here today, Daisy. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today. Good afternoon to you, Joan Jonas. Thank you for being here with us. Before we dive in what I hope will be a compelling conversation, I wanted to take a moment to thank the Brooklyn Rail for their enthusiasm and support in making this talk happen. Very often saying thank you might be just that, but in this case, I want to extend my sincere gratitude to you, Joan, as I'm sincerely thankful for this opportunity to share a moment together. Thank you. By means of introduction, and if such a thing exists when we reflect on a practice that is as prolific and impactful as this one, I'll be reading a short bio to introduce our guests as we share images of the artist's work. Immersed in the 1960s downtown New York art scene, Joan Jonas studied with the choreographer Trisha Brown for 2 years and was influenced by the work of John Cage and Claes Oldenburg. Adopting the idea of art as process, she turned from painting and sculpture to performance art, exploring different aspects of how live event could be structured in time and space. Her early performance, called Mirror Pieces, 1968 to 71, were held in large space and incorporated the use of large and small mirror, either as a central motif or as a props. In the early 70s, her work became increasingly symbolic, gamelike, and ritualistic. In Organic Honey, Visual Telepathy, 1972, one of my favorite work. For example, Joan took the role of Organic Honey, a part real, part mythical, and part fantastical woman who explores the possibility of female imagery and eroticism, repeatedly scanning her own image in a video monitor connected to a live camera. Later that year, she began producing single-channel videos such as Vertical Roll, 1972, in which she uses performance, static, and repetition to investigate the inherent formal qualities of video. By the 80s, she began to create complex, nonlinear narrative premises on literary and historical texts, including science fiction, medieval Icelandic saga, and more recently, the writing and biography of the art historian Aby Warburg. Her most recent body of work explored the relationship between new digital media and performance in multi-channel video installation. Joan, welcome.
Thank you, Daisy. Thank you for asking me. May I just say something in response to your introduction?
Please do. Please do.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a normal thing to say, you know, that I was not really directly influenced by John Cage. Everyone was. So I would never say that in my bio. That's just a very understandable thing to do for the people, using a bio. I would not say I was influenced by him because everybody in my generation was. You know, he was one of the big. So although I knew him and met him, I didn't consider him a direct influence. There were others. And then I also took dance workshops. All the dancers at that time were giving workshops. Yvonne Rainer, Deborah Hay, Steve Paxton, and so on. I took workshops with all of them. So Trisha was important for sure, and she had a workshop in which you were allowed to do anything you felt like doing, and she didn't criticize you or teach you anything of hers. It wasn't about teaching. So I'll just say in those early days, it was about doing. And in some cases, it was about participating, like in Yvonne's work, which was very simple at that time. People were working with everyday movement, like running, standing still, walking. That's no longer the case, but I just wanted to say that little short.
Of course. No, and I appreciate that, because I can only imagine, and I hope we'll maybe dive in a few of the influences and the sources, which I know are much more varied than what we're able to bring into a short blurb. But thank you for making those additions and steering me in the right direction.
I'll also say Claes Oldenburg, yes, because when I saw his work, I saw that I was trained as a visual artist. I mean, that's what my background is. And when I saw Claes Oldenburg's work, his performances, and I saw that a visual artist could make, something theatrical or with movement and so on, and participation. He and others.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I thought maybe one way to start this conversation, well, how are you, Joan?
I'm fine. You're fine too.
Can you share a little bit more about what's on your mind? What are right now maybe the driving forces, obsession, or reflection that are currently guiding your practice?
Well, currently guiding my practice, it's hard to guide my practice right now. I'm having a difficult time. Many artists that I talk to are having a hard time concentrating on their practice. I'm putting together a show that's almost finished in Brazil, quite a big show. So we've been working on that remotely. And that's a survey show. And I'm very sad I can't go to Brazil, but as you know, they're having a hard time there. And I'm also reading a lot. And about a month or two ago, I was beginning to write. You know, that's something I don't usually concentrate on, but I think I could concentrate on that. So I'm trying to figure out how to shift, frankly, because I can't see in the near future being able to work as I usually do. I can't go out in the world with my video camera. So I'll use footage that I shot right before this all happened. And I'm looking into my notes to try to pull together something new. But if I'm going to work with, say, any of the children that I've worked with, we have to do it remotely, and I have to invent a way to do it. I can't directly work with anybody. So it's a very strange, it could be a very interesting time. It's a very strange time that none of us have ever experienced. So.
Yeah, thank you. And I imagine also, well, we're having this conversation through Zoom as opposed to sitting together in a room. The idea of technology, or maybe forced technology as a way to stay in relationship in this moment, present new challenges, maybe some with more potential than others. How are you?
That's new challenges, but I think it also offers our only way to communicate with each other.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's so important. Like, I've started doing Instagram. I never did Instagram before. And I find that as a way of communicating with people through pictures, you know, through photographs.
Yeah.
And it's not it's not my major work or anything like that, but I find it interesting.
Of course. I think one thought that comes to mind, and you pointed to that, is the idea of relationship. I think in your work, that's something that I've always admired, the relationship that you have with fellow artists, scientists, writers, animals that you put at the center of your practice or explore by communication or reflection. And I'm curious if you could speak to the role of being in relationship as part of your practice, and maybe dive a little deeper into how you're thinking about that as the reality is changing right now.
You mean my relationship to the performers and animals and so on?
Yeah, different type of collaborator, the role that being in a relationship has played in your practice.
I think one reason I chose to focus as much as I have on performance is because I really like to work with other people. And through the years, I've had some very important and wonderful relationships with people who have been in my work or working with me, editing. I usually do my own camera work, and but I work with editors. I'm not sophisticated enough to work with a computer, so I work with an editor on the computer. But, you know, the early works that you showed some pictures of, the outdoor works, for instance, in the early 70s, late 60s, the group of artists in downtown New York was much smaller than it is now. And we all knew each other, literally, and went to each other's events and that's how all these different mediums that interacted and came together. And I was interested from the very beginning in bringing together sources of literature, film, poetry, and other sources into this one central place. But anyway, so the way we worked together then was, for instance, I would like to do something, so I'd call my friends and they'd come, and it wasn't that we paid each other then. We just, they would volunteer, like Gordon Matta Clark, and was one example. You saw a picture of him recently. And then later on, when I started teaching my students, not all the time, but I didn't really extensively work with students on my work, but a couple of my students really entered my work for a long period, and they're still friends. I'm very close to them. And then, of course, the animals, the dogs.
Yeah, which you've included and reflected on many works. I know there's drawings of one of your dogs that you act upon as a repetitive, maybe meditation. Is that right? Yeah.
Pardon me?
I said your dogs, your relationship with your animals is something that you reflected on as maybe a repetitive meditation in some case, as we see. Yeah.
Well, I justified it in the very beginning. I came into this very involved with myth because I studied art history, and every painting has a story, and a lot of it's related to myth. And the modernist writers, James Joyce, used myth as a structure in Portrait of the Artist to represent a character. That's what influenced me to start working with myth in my work, really. And so I justified having a dog by saying it was my animal helper. And I really spent a lot of time doing research on rituals of other cultures. And I thought of my own work as a kind of ritual for my culture. But I didn't, I didn't copy other cultures. I invented my own ritual involved with repetition and animals and so on.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about James Joyce, and I know literature plays a big part also in the construction of your work. Can I ask, what are you reading these days?
Well, I read this book called The Tale of Genji, which is a Japanese classic written in the 10th century by a woman. Oh, wow. I was very interested in modernist Japanese writing, and then I thought, oh, they're all men, so I wanted to read by women. And the women were the first writers who wrote novels in the Japanese tradition. So I wanted to read Tale of Genji. It's very long. And then I started reading diaries of court ladies, Japanese. That's one thing. And my friend David Gruber just gave me a book by Ursula Le Guin, and I had never read her. And it's a beautiful book. It's called The Word for World is Forest. It's a beautiful book. So right now I'm not involved in a novel, but I have a number with me, which reading is very important.
Yeah, and how do you integrate literature in your work? I know sometimes if I think about Under the Glacier, the ask as maybe an ongoing reflection, and you'll be quoting some of the writer. What is the role of literature in the making of images or of your work?
Well, it has a long, the usual history of where I started with fairy tales, because I was involved with the idea of myth, and fairy tales are the first kind of very flattened and kind of cardboard cutouts depiction of characters, and one grows up reading fairy tales. So my first narrative was based on a Grimm's Brothers fairy tale. And then I really followed it in a kind of logical way by going to the Icelandic saga, which is a more sophisticated way of storytelling and writing. Yeah. And what I do is I analyze a story. I write down, this is the way I began, the colors, the characters, the scenes, and I work quite a bit before I actually start, and often I don't make a real script until afterwards. But for the latest piece, Reanimation, or one of the latest pieces, based on an Icelandic writer, Halldór Laxness, under the glacier. I just took fragments of that incredible book. And the idea of reanimation was, he wrote so beautifully about nature, which is something I'm more and more involved in and have been from the very beginning. And he wrote the most beautiful thing about bees and how bees function, and birds and fish. He's very beautiful poetic writer, and as well as writer on many levels. So I brought fragments of that into it. It's impossible to do the whole book. So I don't take whole incredible narratives, you know.
Of course, yeah. I think it's really beautiful in revisiting some of your work, how pieces of literature came back into mind, came back into the mix, and they act as a beautiful navigation, very poetic, between different body of work. I really appreciated that. I was also curious to hear you talk. I know you love collecting objects for the love of collecting, maybe, and I was curious, how do objects, for example, the mirror, which we see, which we've seen in some of the images, keep interesting you? And maybe one other question is how reworking or adapting them become part of the practice.
Well, I work in that way with many different elements in my work, bringing things back and weaving them back in, because when you put an object in one context, it can mean something differently than it would in another context. The mirrors, I was inspired to work with mirrors by Borges, the Argentinian writer, who in his book Labyrinths, says some beautiful things about mirrors and their mystery and complexity. And so the mirror was my first prop. And when I began to work with video, I translated the idea of the mirror, you know, into video, the monitor being an ongoing mirror. Yeah. And so they also become metaphors. Another recurring theme, I wanted to bring drawing into the work. And so I thought of the basic elements of drawing, the circle and the line. So I made drawings of circles and lines, and then did choreography based on that motif. But I had hoops, big metal hoops, 6-foot hoops, that people were rolled around in. Susan Rothenberg, in one case, myself, but Susan Rothenberg was rolled around in a metal hoop. And then sticks, from the very beginning, sticks, poles have been part of my vocabulary. So those are elements that are in, like, if you look at other cultures, and you see that sticks are very important. Yeah. And as objects, as they represent all kinds of different things. I use them as distancing devices. I just recently did that in relation to our present time, but also to measure off spaces between people and so on. Anyway, so those are just some of the, and then the mirror, I just brought them back in a large way, but because people ask me now to do the mirror performances, and I enjoy that. I didn't think I would enjoy repeating my work, but I have really enjoyed that. And now actually the Tate bought the mirror performance, which is great. So it can be done anywhere at any time under certain circumstances. And yeah, but anyway, that sort of partly answers your question.
Yeah, well, it's also interesting, and I maybe like to dive a little bit deeper in what you just said about the idea of repeating and how that comes to be. For example, the work that Tate bought, and revisiting the possibilities of those objects being reactivated. How's that process coming together? How's it been?
Well, it started out with the Guggenheim wanting to do the mirror performance, and I never believed in repeating my performances because you cannot do them the same. So then I worked out the new version of the mirror performance based on photographs and my memory and so on, which was as close to the early one as possible. And I really enjoyed seeing it evolve and work for an audience. And then when I did the show at Tate Britain, at Tate Modern, Catherine Wood, between us, was quite a load. She wanted me to do an outdoor performance on the banks of the Thames. Oh. And then I wanted to do another updated version of my performance, Mirage. And in both cases, I had to completely reinvent the performance for the for the bank of the Thames, yeah. Because it was a different space than Jones Beach. And so I had the performance take place on opposite sides of the river, and each pier mirror image of the other. And because I wasn't going to, until I figured that out, I said, I can't do this. This is impossible. And then Mirage was interesting because I performed in it against videos and photographs of myself in 1976, which I did not anticipate how weird that would be. For me, saying it, the audience. But anyway, so something else comes out of those situations, which I find interesting. I can never just completely copy something. I mean, it can't be copied in the same way. So I find that interesting to do that.
Mm, to embrace what are the unusual or surprising new discoveries in revisiting the process. Maybe it's a good segue to talk a little bit more about the idea of the archive or self-registering oneself. I was interested in reading about the Artist Archive Initiative and the development of the Joan Jonas knowledge base and their current work in archiving your practice. Can you speak about that process? How is it?
The knowledge base, it's based in NYU is now the place where it's happening. And it was begun, now I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, a curator who used to be the restorer at the Museum of Modern Art started it.
Is it Claes?
Barbara Clausen is the one who's doing she's in charge of my knowledge base. They've already done David Wojnarowicz. They're trying to develop a way to have a knowledge base for artists like me who have complex work and many layers and different mediums, and to bring those together. So they took 2 pieces, the organic honey work, all the different organic honey in that series. You mentioned a few of the videos. There's the performance, there's the installation, and there are 4 or 5 autonomous video works. And Mirage, same situation with various points of view and photographs. And so what they did was they had a team, and they came to my loft. They went through everything to find every bit of information of those 2 works that was possible to find in my loft, in my archives. Mm-hmm. And they entered it, and they also have very sophisticated ways of dealing with this, and they're trying to develop. I mean, you'll see it. It'll be ready. I think it's going to be launched next year, in a year. It's ready now, but they don't want to launch it yet. But it'll be ready to launch. And so it's just an example of some of my work in that situation, in a digital archive.
And maybe to add to that, because I imagine it requires a lot of interviews with you in talking about how you could imagine this work being reactivated. As part of this process, what is your relationship with oral history as it navigates your own practice and the future consideration?
Yeah. Well, they did interview me quite a bit, but they interviewed me. The interviews were about what was it really like? What did you do? Very factual, trying to get the original information. Yeah. And the oral history. Well, when you say oral history, I think of the oral tradition. And I think that my work and many people's work comes from poetry originated in an oral tradition as an oral. And I think that my work, the way I see it, I studied, I really look at the way things begin. And for instance, how did Western art begin in Mycenae and in Crete, or Eastern art in the Chinese bronzes. And I think that gives you clues to how things, what art is all about. And also, I worked with Maya Daren's footage that she shot in Haiti of drawing on the earth, the way that they, in their rituals, they draw on the earth. I'm just mentioning all this because I think we come from these different traditions. And for me, the oral tradition is really, we're related to the oral tradition and of course, storytelling. So I related to that, and I'm not sure if you could tell me what you think. You could help me a little bit here, if that answers your question or not.
I mean, that's a beautiful way to think about it. I was curious about what it means maybe as the process of archiving those work through the knowledge base, in sharing your thoughts or maybe guidance. How much do you want to put into giving directive, and how much you want to leave out for maybe a form of interpretation as a work might be revisited or reperformed?
So it's very, I would like to do that with all of the works. it's Barbara Clausen is the person who's been organizing this, and I've been interviewed by her and and others. And for me, as much information as I can give, I want to give. I'm not holding anything back. But for instance, the mirror piece to be redone. I'm working with a very wonderful woman who now lives in Switzerland, and I taught her from the video performance of video. It helps a lot now. The video performance of the mirror piece at the Guggenheim, we pieced together. We perfected that, and now she knows it perfectly, and she can teach much better than I can. She can teach that mirror piece to other people, and that is the way. And I have a video of Mirage that I performed. I'd like people to refer to those sources, because on the other hand, I really find it kind of weird and interesting. I've had a couple of students groups ask if they can redo some of my early performances. And one of them was a group in Italy, and they wanted to do a performance of a piece called Waltz, which is a video. And they did. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen, but I thought it was funny and fascinating what they did. It was a performance, and I appreciated it, I must say. But it could be a disaster. And then my students in Venice did a surprise video for me to reproduce certain actions out of the outdoor works, Joan's beach piece, and Delay. And it was beautiful. They took little fragments and they put them in different locations in Venice, in beautiful squares and along the canals. And that was really beautiful. So, you know, it works in different ways. I would like to do what I did with all my performance, if they're going to be done. But I have to give up, you know, having any control pretty soon. You can't control, you know. I just hope it inspires people.
Is it hard to let go? Is it hard?
It's easier than it was. Yeah.
I was in reflecting about our conversation, it made me think, and I know I shared that with you ahead of this conversation, the last moment that I spent in a museum before this pandemic was at MoMA, and it was with your work Mirage, which we spoke a little bit about. And it just made me think about how incredible having this museum experience was, even more than I even knew at the moment. And I'm curious in thinking with you, what, coming from performance and the importance of presence in performance, how do you think about maybe some of the constraint of this time and what it means to be present, what we need to stay apart? How are those dichotomies being reflected upon as part of your maybe reflection or practice?
Well, over the years, I've worked quite a bit with installations. Since 1994 was my first big installation show. So I've been doing that for a long time, and I don't, you know, it doesn't bother me at all not to be there. In fact, what I like is to have my work up and not, the performance lasts for an hour. It takes a huge amount of work, and then it's over. And I'd like more people to experience it. So those works that are installations have been translated. They're not performances, you know, they're translations and developments that come out of the performance and live event. And sometimes the installation comes first and then the performance. So now I think that it's a very complex situation, and I miss having normal conversations with my friends. And of course I miss going out and seeing people that I haven't seen. As far as, you know, I'm old, you know, so I don't feel, I'm not sure what is we don't know about the future. We're optimistic about things coming back to a certain place, but we don't know in what form, how will that be? We don't know yet. Yeah. And so I am thinking about doing something like I had one of my performers, Noah Delarme, who was in the piece in Venice. He wants to work with me. He's 17. He's in New Haven. I'm trying to think of a way that we can work together, and also the other performers in that piece, how we can work without it looking like a Zoom thing, you know? It's hard. Zoom is very aesthetically difficult for me.
We are witnessing.
Yeah, it's, and also it takes a certain psychic energy that, like after one of these things, I'm exhausted. I don't know. That's what my friends who teach say, the same thing.
Me too.
Using remote. So we'll see where we are. I'm very curious about what the world is going to be like after this is over. And I think that we won't understand it until it's over. And I think that work will be affected by it. We'll all be affected. Not everybody, for sure.
Of course, yeah. No, it's just interesting to think about those technology being at the service of this moment and how something maybe compelling aesthetically or as part of an ongoing reflection can come out of it too. So I'll be on the lookout for that. One backdrop in your practice, or something that I like to engage with is the relationship you have with nature and landscape being in nature or in the city at time. And I'm curious if you could share a little bit more with us. How does nature or landscape keep informing your practice? And what are the ways that it has shaped your image making process?
Well, I grew up in the summers going to New Hampshire and being near a forest. And so from the very beginning, I've been, I love to be alone by myself in the forest. And I love to swim. And then living by the ocean for many years in New York on the coast, developing a relationship to that. And when I first, thought of performing, of course, the outdoor landscape is a beautiful setting. And one thing I saw in the 60s, which influenced me, I could never pictorially or in any way refer to it, but the Hopi, I was very lucky. I was really doing research about the rituals of other cultures. And I heard that the Hopi snake dance was going to be performed and outsiders like me could go to it. And so I went to New Mexico and I saw the Hopi snake dance, which was the most amazing experiences of my life. Yeah. And now outsiders can't see it, which is good. I was very lucky to see it. So I'll just say that the idea of performing outside in a kind of, working with, I don't work with snakes or anything like that, but working with, and many cultures work with animals and foliage and sticks and trees and all kinds of things. And also this idea of the bricoleur, that you work with what is at hand. So I did this performance in Nova Scotia on the beach where I worked with what I found on the beach, long poles and those things you saw me standing on, the broken trunks of trees and so on. So nature has just always been part of my work. It inspires me because I can go out in nature and feel, I'm trying to work that way now a little bit, but it's difficult. But yeah, I'm not really in that kind of nature, but I think I am by a beach, I'm very lucky. And that you can feel wild. That could be wild nature, the beach and the sea. But in New York, when I go back, I don't know, I'll find something different. But one has to keep going. But I don't know if that answers your question. I just started watching a film from New Zealand. It just struck a bell when I saw the first part. It's about the story of Aborigines. It's very sad. I couldn't watch it. But the first scene, there's a scene of them in nature, touching things and making things. And I related to that very closely. But one other story I just read, a review of books about animals and how we have animal rights. Animals should have rights and animal language and so on, which is a lot of research being done on that. And in particular, they mentioned a park. I mean, this is like the culture of, say, in New Zealand, they mentioned a public park, which used to be named a name, I can't remember the name, and it was called the National Park. And then they simply changed that to that name. So it meant that the park had a name like a person. And then they took a river, and the river has two guardians, a Maori and a government guardian of the river. So the river has a presence. And to me, that's beautiful and poetic. And so right now I'm looking for things like that. And I also saw a wonderful lecture in Switzerland in February, right before this happened, this man, Bill, I have his name, sorry, Bill Gamage, who's maybe some of you know him, Bill Gamage. No. He's Australian and partly Australian and partly, Australian and partly, whatever. But he gave a beautiful lecture about the Aboriginals claiming a piece of land as theirs. The government was going to take over. And they constructed a huge picture on the land that was theirs using materials from around. Beautiful picture. And the government won. I mean, they won. The government came and looked and they said, okay, you've claimed it, this is yours. And the other thing is he recommended this book, which I can't remember the name of the book, but when the Europeans came to Australia, it had already been developed as a landscape by the indigenous people. So that gives me hope, I have to say.
Yeah, I can agree with that. And it's something we want to hold on to as an inspiration also for contexts that would require that kind of hopeful and forceful setting. I like the way you talk about nature as this ongoing and maybe untapped source of inspiration and references that can poetically enter your practice. I'm curious, Joan, could you speak to maybe a few meaningful influence that have been ongoing throughout your practice? It could be filmmakers or books, different kind of sources, but I'm curious about what has been carrying you through these years. And
well, film is a very basic influence. And for instance, in particular, I mean, probably a lot of different films I won't bother to mention, but an ongoing one, Ozu, the Japanese director, and Japanese films in general. I did for a long time, was very involved with French and Russian films. The early, again, from the very beginning, I look at how things begin. So I was interested in very early filmmakers, the first films, and then literature, yes, poetry, the structure of poetry, history. I studied art history, and pictures. I love pictures. I mean, in the beginning, I really talked about Renaissance painting as a big influence. The way, when I first started working with video, how to frame something, how to make a picture, and how to make a picture in a frame, how to compose, how to layer, how to make depth. And so all these pictorial devices have been influenced by the history of painting, for instance, and so on. I don't know, there are many, I could go on.
Yeah, of course, please do, but it's just so great to revisit those paths with you and think about them as we've been looking at those images together and can ponder on them with your thoughts.
And inspiring me has been sound, of course, and composers I've worked with. Like I just worked with Jason Moran, we did 4 pieces together, which was amazing. And now I work with Iko Amori. So the music, even if I develop it totally myself, when the music comes into it, it transforms it. So, for me, that's very important, sound.
Of course. And how would you speak about that relationship with composer? Do you see it as maybe a conversation with the props that you present to them and they respond to it?
No, what I do with Jason, I did with Iko and others, we sit down and I tell them about the piece and I explain it and I show them all, the videos are all done by the time they come into it.
Okay.
I show them the videos and then we go to the rehearsal. With Jason, we were very lucky. We had 6 weeks to rehearse at Deer Beacon. And then we go to the space and every day we went and I project the background and then he would respond to it. And we say, okay, yeah, I like this, I don't like that, this works, that doesn't work. And my movements are inspired by sound. So my performative movements are inspired by the sound, partly, for sure. And that's one of the ways we work together. Same with Equally, we did it the same way.
That's beautiful. I was watching Reanimation, the documentary on reanimation a week ago. And it was just so beautiful to see you work with Jason Moran and having this kind of language being built up through looking at the image together and almost creating an image in response to each other in a way too, or live as you're experimenting together.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you could, or if we could touch upon maybe what feels very urgent to you at this moment. What feels like maybe an urgency you want to address in your work?
Oh, I can't address. The urgency is that everybody stay safe and healthy and wear your mask and you know, be careful. And that to me, that's the urgency right now. And I mean, behind that is the urgency of staying, keeping your spirits up through your work, or however you have, whichever way you have of keeping your spirits up. I think it's a very difficult time for many people. And many people are alone, isolated. And so I think those are the urgencies right now. The well-being of the country, my God, you know, November, urgency. So that to me is right now. And I can't put that in my work, you know, we'll have to see.
Of course, of course.
I mean, I have in the past, of course, addressed issues in my work. My work always responds to the present, you know, whatever, like the lines in the sand. I started working on it was based on Helen, a story of Helen in Egypt. She didn't go to Troy, she went to Egypt and the Trojan War. And then 9/11 happened just at that moment. And I literally couldn't work for 3 months. And then the metaphor of the Trojan horse kept coming up again and again. I don't know. So you never know how it's going to.
Of course. But that's actually where I wanted to go. So thank you. You brought me back because in reflecting about the political aspect of what comes into the work and how then it comes to be read or to be offered becomes just, can be very urgent, but can also lead to, just fruitful sets of reflection. So I appreciate that. Maybe one area that I'd like to explore with you is something that I've always been very impressed is the scale of your project, how the layer and the construction is such an expensive and almost omnivorous endeavor. I'm curious, where does this come from, the scale in which your project takes shape? Would you say it's from the theater world?
No. I know it comes from years of building it up and developing a kind of language, a visual language. And of course I like theater, but it doesn't really come from the theater world, no. But more comes from film. And by, you know, at the very beginning with video, the inclusion of video, and when I got a video camera in 1968, and then bringing video, the possibility of having a double situation going on with the video projection and a live performance and a live camera and so on and so forth. So the technology gave me a lot of possibilities and ideas for layering devices and spatial situations. And so since then, I've just been refining that. And now in the last, since, I don't know, for quite a while, a number of years, maybe 6 or 7 years, I've been dealing with with backdrops. It also depended on the technology as cameras developed. The first cameras were black and white. Then one was able to afford color cameras. And so large backgrounds, which became parallel narrative to the action in the foreground. This is in the performative aspect of my work.
Yeah.
And then the layering, you know, the fact that I can have put a sequence of, like in the Venice piece, the children working against the background of the beehives and the beehive structures, so that you can layer and make another meaning by the layering, putting together disparate things and layering things against in the flat surface. Yeah.
You touch upon technology and the way they have evolved with you or through some of your processes. I'm maybe wondering what is the space that you leave for new technologies to come in? Like is iPhone images something that you layer in or play with as well? Or
I put iPhone, the only really kind of weird new one was the, what do you call the double thing? the little camera that goes underwater, the sports camera.
Oh, okay.
What's it called? You know.
I don't know. Does GoPro?
The GoPro. I made a whole work based on the GoPro. All the other, the other technology is just the technology I've been working with. People say new technology, but it's just, I'm a video artist, it's the same camera technology I've been working with. The GoPro is one example of some different kind of device. And I work with my iPhone. It's a very good camera, and but I just put it in with everything else. It's not, I haven't made something especially based on the idea of the iPhone, but I use it now particularly for filming things and for taking photographs.
One secret desire that I had as part of this conversation was to revisit a work, as I mentioned, that I think is extraordinary, Organic Honey. And I'm curious, and I know it plays, it's a seminal work of yours that has influenced so many artists to think about female representation and the maybe malleability of those codes as we navigate them. I'm curious if you could speak to what sparked this piece. How did Organic Honey came to be, and what were you exploring as the beginning of this research?
Well, I'll just say, I've said this many times, and it's maybe obvious, but when we all got these porta packs in the late 60s, and you sat down and you saw yourself on the screen of the monitor, instantaneous feedback, that was quite a moment. And it's hard to imagine what that was like for us. And so the character of Organic Honey came out of that, looking at myself and manipulating, wearing costumes and masks and working with the image, really. It was a closed circuit situation, the camera and the monitor, and it could be a projection. So that I developed a character because I didn't want to be myself. I wanted to play a kind of role. And the whole piece is based on, it was at the time of a very strong aspect of the women's movement, the late 60s. And women were really bursting out of their seams at that time. And so Organic Honey came out of the concern with, the question is, what is it to be female? Because there's all this discussion of male imagery and female imagery. And so it was kind of research about, I didn't have a decisive answer, but so I used a mask and played with my, how do I look female, or how do I not look female, or what is female? And so, I had all these costumes. I got at the Rose Bowl in California. I collected costumes and objects. That's when I started using objects in my work, because I could show the objects to the camera and the camera would see. It wasn't like they were far away from the audience. I could work with small objects. And so I had a collection of fans from my grandmother, which fit perfectly into this idea. And and I did have reggae music in that piece because it was just the time Richard Long was in New York, and I met him in London. He told me to go down to Portobello Road. So I got this reggae music, and that's why I have the reggae music in Organic Honey. I found it so inspiring and beautiful. And part of the piece's space is reacting to that music. And then when I was just about to do the performance, I saw the jar on the table that said Organic Honey, and that's why I named it Organic Honey. But I was also working with the idea of this, the two things going on at once, the live camera and the projection of my actions or the other performer's actions on the wall being a counter narrative to the actual live performance. And the audience saw those two things together. They saw a detail of the performance while they saw the entire performance. And so that was my main interest. Everything always had to be based on something like that, perception was a big question for me.
And it translates so beautifully in many pieces, but this work has stayed with me over the years. Just so thankful to have you revisit it with us.
Thank you.
Of course, I want to be generous to the fact that our audience might want to ask you some question. I could keep going as I enjoyed this time so much, but I want to leave some room for the generous.
Sure. I just want to say that I'm very happy to be with Daisy, because we sat next to each other at dinner about 2 or 3 years ago, and we had such a nice conversation. Neither of us forgot. So that's very nice when that happens.
It's true. And maybe that's a good, when we met, I was just struck by how magical and simple this time with you was, and unusual nature of just sitting together and getting to know one another. So it just felt like a friendship between two strangers. And so I'm so thankful for this time with you, Joan, and I cannot wait to sit right next to you.
Yeah, we'll just bring that into our present Zoom talk.
Yes, please.
That memory.
Yes, please, yes.
Thank you both so much for allowing us to sit next to you at the proverbial table for this conversation. We do have a ton of questions. People are very excited to speak with you. So I'm going to start by handing the mic over to Darla Migan. Darla, I'm going to prompt you to turn your mic on. You should be able to, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
It's so public. I really love this conversation. I'm going to turn my video on as well. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I'm really new to art in general. I really have only started to learn the near history of contemporary art very recently. And one of the first pieces of art that I saw was in the conditions of being art at the Hadley Museum, and Joan's piece in that wonderful exhibition. And one thing that struck me right away is that I recognized that there was storytelling deep at the heart of the practice immediately. And I think it's because of, I'm not sure what it is exactly, but it certainly, oh, I didn't turn the video on, sorry. Here I am, hi. So it struck me that like, there's a practice, a process to telling a story from the point of view of people who know literature, and it sounds like that this is clearly the case with you, Joan. So I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to the differences between telling story visually and ways that translation perhaps doesn't happen as well orally or through written text. So just sort of maybe speaking generally to the way that the practice developed over time. And you said, I love how you were immediately like, not theater. So just curious about moving story between text, orality, and visual presentation and video.
It's a hard question, Darla, thank you. Well, I never change, I'll tell you right away that I never rewrite what I quote, never. I just take fragments. It's one thing I do. I cut it up and maybe I rearrange it sometimes, but I never ever change the words because that's what the essence of it is. And what I do is the visual part, my free association, I give myself, it's not, I don't call it illustration, I call it representation of the story. And so sometimes it might seem very far away from the written text. And sometimes it might seem very close, but that's basically, I don't know if that answers your question.
Definitely. Just wonderful to see how you see. Yes, thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And of course, Daisy, as it relates to the broader conversation we've been having, feel free to jump into. We'll leave your mic live.
Thank you.
Karen, I am coming to you next. You should be live now.
Oh, okay. I can't see myself, but maybe that's good. I think my question was, going back to the mythology and the research, and I guess I wanted to ask Joan whether there's a thread in the sorts of things that you research. If there's I know a lot of it seems to have to do with very primal meanings, and I guess I wanted to go deeper into what that might be. What sorts of primal meanings?
Oh, I can't.
And
really...
that's a big one. I know. I'm sorry. It's a lot of history too. So, has that changed? Has it?
I think it changed a little bit over the years. Yeah, since like the '60s until now. It's hard to say. I mean, I go from one to another. Also, for instance, I went from the fairy tale, and I have to say that a very good friend of mine is Susan Howe. And when I thought of what fairy tale shall I use, there's a vast number, I called Susan. And this is her son's favorite fairy tale, The Juniper Tree, which is, it's a very kind of really vicious, terrible, you know, typical Grimm Brothers fairy tale. But it's her son's favorite story. That was always the way that I could explain. I did it as a performance in Philadelphia at the ICA, and the mothers came to me beforehand and said, "Oh my God." And I said, I just read The Uses of Enchantment, I can't remember the name of the author, about the function of fairy tales for children. And, you know, one of the functions is they lose fear. And so I was able to explain to the mothers, I mean, this is just one example. And then we went on with the performance, and the children they loved it, of course. They love those stories. And then from there, you know, then I thread, you know, Icelandic sagas. A friend of mine told me they were beautiful. So I get leads from different people. And then somebody told me about Sweeney Astray, the poem translated by Seamus Heaney about a king who goes mad in battle. And so I was interested in the theme of war, for instance, and how that drives one mad, for instance, as a theme. That's just some of the many things. Right now, you know, it was nature, obviously, in Iceland, and the idea that the world is melting under the glacier. And I didn't work on a single story for my fish pieces. You know, I decided to leave it very open. Right now, I'm looking for a story, actually, but I have lots of fragments. And I looked at my old notes, and I just quoted Anna Akhmatova, one of her poems that she wrote in 1919. Why is this age worse than earlier ages? It really, to me, reflects what we're going through right now. So, you know, in a way, that just tells you a little bit. It would take a long conversation.
Sorry.
That's okay.
That's good. Thank you. That's helpful.
Wonderful. I'm coming next to you, Mark. You should get a little prompt to turn your mic on. I can also read it on your behalf. Oh, there you are.
Hi, thank you so much. Sorry, I'm outside jogging and running in the heat and listening to you guys. It's beautiful. Joan, when I was studying with you at Kent State in 1977, take an image and to work with that image, and I didn't know what an image was, believe it or not, and that cracks me up to this day. Like, that's become an image in my history. But anyway, I was like trying to work it out with you and couldn't quite do it. And when you just said that you were interested in pictures, you were attracted to pictures as well as film, I just wondered what you were going for when you told us to pick an image. Like, what was your idea? Where did you want me to go with that? Where were you leading me? I went other places, but I was wondering what that meant for you.
Well, I think
as a teacher.
As you're explaining to me, I'm thinking I wasn't a very good teacher if you didn't understand that, because I should have helped you a little bit more. It's a very vague idea just to choose an image. For me, it was, you know, choose a picture of a tree or a picture of, in a museum, a picture in a museum, begin with a painting in a museum. But yeah, I think it was too vague. I think that you're right, that you were right to be a little bewildered, that I should have told you more.
But I wonder,
it represents beginning with something. I mean, how do you begin? You just step into it and you let it come to you. How do you begin? That's one, I made a video called something like that. And sometimes there's actually a Sufi meditation, which I'm not going to explain very well. And it's a meditation where you stand until something comes to you. A movement just comes to you. And I'm sure that's a very bad way of explaining it, but I used to do that, and I used to bring that into my teaching situations, that we would all stand there, and then everybody would start moving depending on what comes to them, or they work on other people's movements, and so on. So it's just a beginning, and it really is very simple.
And you were a great teacher. I really got so much from it, even though it wasn't I didn't feel like I was doing it right, it still led me somewhere. And maybe that was the goal that
There's
you
no
just
right
described.
and wrong.
Right.
You were wrong to think you weren't doing it right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next, we are going to head over to Kathleen Ritter. Kathleen, I'm giving you the mic. Hi.
Hello. I'll turn on my video as well. Hi. Greetings from Paris, where there's a heat wave. Yeah, I had a question for you in thinking about this question about...
Can't hear her.
Kathleen, can you turn on your volume? We don't hear you very well.
Give me a second.
And hello to this beautiful little girl in your arms.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, great, yeah.
And my question was about what you brought up earlier about this particular moment of crisis that we're in. And this is really a question for both of you, because I think in a moment of crisis, whether it's personal or political or a health crisis like we're in now, the work that we do as creative producers loses meaning for a particular period of time. It's hard, or at least it's hard to find meaning in it for a while. And I was struck by your answer, Joan, when Daisy asked the question, you know, what do you feel is urgent right now? And you said that we wear masks, which is a very pragmatic question in this particular moment. And so it made me reflect on, you know, how do we locate or find meaning in our work as creative producers during these moments of crises. And you mentioned a couple of them in your lifetime during 9/11, for example, and now. How does an art practice weather a crisis? And I'm interested to hear that from both of you.
I'll just say a little bit. I can only speak for myself. I think many people have a practice that stays the same throughout, you know, centuries in a way. You know, they'll do the same that they've been doing for a long time. That's one kind of practice. I can't speak for other people. I can just say one just has to concentrate. I don't know what to say about that. I think for me, I have to keep every day making drawings. Every day I write notes in my notebook, and it's fragmented, and I'm searching for something, and I'm developing a new piece for a show in April. You know, that's just an everyday thing that you do without having definitive answers. People have to keep going. And then many people, like producers like you, I guess, they're dealing with the reality of what's happening financially with their institutions. And what the other double thing we haven't mentioned is, just to make it very clear, Black Lives Matter, these demonstrations. I was in New York during, that's something that's so important that's going on now. We think, how is that going to play out? And are those issues going to remain important and remain things that how do we change? That's the basic question. I don't know if it's about art. Anyway, Daisy, what about you?
That's such a great question. I think for me, part of the urgency has been in preserving and thinking about relationship that I want to make sure I stay active in. And that might be as a way to learn, as a way to process, as a way to witness, and as a way to remember together, because I feel that's part of maybe my responsibility as I participate in this art ecosystem. The prompt to be in conversation with Joan is one moment where I want to nurture something that felt important to me, and it felt precious to trigger that, or at least try. But it makes me think of how do we continue, and how do we do that in a sustainable way is a question I ask myself all the time, so that it can sustain crisis and maybe shift what normal or what expectation we have constantly, so we can be more adaptable in the way we are present for each other, in the way we give opportunity, in the way we take opportunities and build on them. But I try to do this at least I try. I don't know if I'm succeeding, but what does it mean to remember this time, and what do I carry with me in the future? Feels like interesting duality to keep very close to me at this moment.
I just want to say that in spite of what I've said, I think this Zoom experience is, we're not going to let go of this immediately afterwards. And it'll be interesting to see how that, this kind of communication goes on. But like Instagram, it seems like it's just a container. But I really have enjoyed my little contact with people I know who send pictures and the kind of pictures they sent and the comments. It's a very small thing, but it's a new kind of relationship actually to communicate through these images. And who knows how that, if that'll, you know, it might not go on like that and people might get ideas about it, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah. What's interesting about how both of you responded is that it's a way of strengthening, remembering, or reconfiguring new relationships in the world. And I think that speaks to the reason why you've come together in this conversation. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. It's always wonderful to also have writers in the audience. Okay, so next we're gonna come over to you, Bob, to ask your question. You got the mic?
To whom? I got the mic.
Hi,
Joan.
Hi, Fong. How are you?
No, Fong's the one with the sunglasses.
I know.
Can you hear me?
I can hear Fong. Can I?
Great. So, hi, how are you? What a wonderful lunchtime
Oh, wait a minute. Is this Bob
moment.
Holman? Who's talking?
Yeah.
It's Bob. Bob is
Bob.
Oh, Bob Holman. Yeah, hi.
Hi. So I was loving your talk about the about animals, and was thinking back to that night when we had the Sami poet doing his yoiking, speaking as an animal, and just wondered if you could talk about that, your relationship with animals as seen. I can't think of that fellow's name. He had the most amazing shoes.
Yeah.
Joan Jonas was there that night.
He's an elf.
Yeah.
He's an elf.
That's,
Ande Sambe, his name is.
there it is.
Yeah.
Ande Sambe. So does yoiking, speaking through the voice of the wolf or the fly, have, you know, how do you relate to that?
Well, I can only say I relate. I think it's wonderful. I'll just explain who Ande Sambe is. I met him in Norway when I was working on filming, actually, in the Lofoten Islands for the work Reanimation. And I met him. He was a friend of a friend, and he's a Sami. He's a Sami. He lives in Norway. He's a lawyer, human rights lawyer, and the Samis. He's a singer. And the Samis sing these incredible sounds that are based on, as Bob said, wild animals and creatures and all kinds of things. And we became friends, and he came to New York and he recorded something for me, which I've used in, I think, 3 different works. I use it over and over again, and he doesn't mind it. But he didn't want to record one of his songs from the Sami. So he made a new sound, which wasn't related to those that we just listed. He didn't want to use that tradition. And well, I can only say that I wish I could do that, you know. I think that to be able to sing in a voice that is of an animal or a creature would be wonderful. And maybe it's because I lack the courage or something like that, but it's not in my tradition. But to me, that was completely magical. And he dresses like an elf with a little hat and pointed shoes, but he's a human rights lawyer. And I'll just tell an experience. We were at Documenta together, and we were looking at these weavings of a Norwegian weaver, a woman, I think from the early part of the last century. And the weaver, some of the pictures were depicting what happened to some of the Sami in relation to situations. And their heads were cut off, and the Norwegian government took the heads and put them away someplace and kept them. And he saw those murals, those rugs, and he gasped because he knew what they were. And he had just negotiated with the Norwegian government to get the heads back to the Sami people. So I'll just say, I'm telling that story just to tell what a completely wonderful person and interesting, complete person he is, besides being a singer. But Bob, thank you for mentioning him.
Well,
And we
yeah,
were
Joan, for me, he's a singer, but he is a poet. That's
Yes.
a tradition that he sings in. It's called yoik.
That's
And
right.
yoiking is an extraordinary oral tradition that has, where the poems have no beginnings and no endings. They're
Right.
a continuum of fugal ongoing, So
Right.
I call him a poet laureate, but if you want him to be a singer, it's okay.
He's both,
Yeah.
Bob. He could be both, right? No, but I remember we were in a Chinese restaurant. Yeah, we were in a Chinese restaurant, remember? And he would get up in the middle of the restaurant and yoik for the whole restaurant, like at a drop of a hat. He was remarkable. He is remarkable. Let's get him back here, Bob.
All right, let's do it.
Okay,
In the after.
it's a deal. Yeah.
Awesome. So next I will ask a question on behalf of an audience member, Piriana Cavalcino has asked.
Cavalcante.
Cavalcate?
Mhm.
Thank you. Is the element of chance important in your life and work?
Yes, it is, of course. Yeah, it is. But I don't depend on it, and it's not my main, everything's not based on chance. And I suppose that's the main big word that comes from, what's his name, that we mentioned at the beginning of this, the composer, the idea of chance. And I used to throw the I Ching. Chance is one of the structures of the universe. And, I run into people by chance. I find people by chance, and it's very important. But finally, the work's not based entirely on chance.
Yeah. Someone is reminding us, John Cage, was it the name you were looking for?
Yeah.
There you go.
Thank you.
Of course.
Wonderful. Mandy, I'm going to give you the mic now to ask your question. Thank you all for these wonderful questions.
Thank you. Joan, I've met you a few times over the years in different environments, very kind of tangentially, I guess. I've always been interested in, there's always something very essential about place in your work. And I work in video also, although kind of coming from a different perspective, because I reference popular cinema or very specific types of art images in my work. And I'm interested in what you might say about how the place affects how you process a concept or how you go into a concept, like the environment, the location, whether it's a foreign location or a familiar location.
Well, it really depends. And sometimes I look for locations, and sometimes I shoot things in my loft with backgrounds that are the location, video backdrops or video projections, which make a location. The location has a lot, and then the location, for instance, for my Icelandic saga, the Volcano Saga, I went to Iceland, and I had to hire a film crew, and that was the location for that piece. Not for the whole thing, but for most of it. So it varies with each piece, of course. And then when I was I do remember living in Berlin and wishing that I'd done more shooting there, because there were many great locations in the 80s. cities have changed a lot, and now, like New York, I think is, I'm sure there are many interesting locations in New York, but there was one where I went out with a cameraman, Andy Mann, and Pat Steer, and we went down with my props, the big cones, to the Wall Street area. This was in 1976, and improvised with the cones. And Pat and I both had long dresses on and running around, dragging the cones, dropping them. It was a beautiful location, and it made a very magical. And there was a man who happened to be there who kept chasing Pat. I mean, that became part of the narrative because of, you know, he got a thing about Pat. And I've used that video in several different ways. It's called Street Scene. And I used it in my Reading Dante piece because I thought it evoked the purgatory. No, it evoked, yeah, purgatory. And so locations provide different backgrounds, and also they change. They could be, one location could serve as a different, in one story it would look one way, another, the story would be affected by it in another way. So anyway, that's.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Sebastian, coming over to you. I believe it's you, but correct me if I've got your abbreviation wrong.
Hi, it's Sergio. Sergio,
Sergio.
I saw you in the chat. Anyway, yes, I have a simple question, and somebody gave already a recommendation in the chat. Let me just turn on the camera. So in Spanish, we have this philologist called Margaret Frank, who at some point in 2006, she was my professor of philology, precisely a class on this subject. It was the medieval oral poetry, and people sometimes get confused, like how you access that kind of text. If it's oral, it should be lost. And what she does is that she, well, as a philologist, right, she looks into, I guess, canonic texts and finds and discerns those chants and lullabies and pieces of text that simply do not respond to the canon, that they were probably copied by the author from the oral tradition, right? And you were pointing at your interest in the oral tradition. I was wondering if there's any kind of like a corpus like that in English philology, if you are aware of any study that will compile this kind of work, you know, in this philological, almost archaeological kind of like endeavor. I don't know if you.
I don't know exactly how to answer your question, but I can say that the Icelandic saga that I worked with, the Icelandic sagas come from an oral tradition, and they were stories told orally. And then at one point, somebody wrote them down and probably altered them. But there's that, and I think in many cultures that exists, going from the oral tradition to the written tradition.
Right. I mean, that would be the example of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It will also be the example of
that's right,
Hispanic texts like Rabbi Nalachi or the Popol Vuh and things like that. But I guess what Margaret Frank did was like a corpus. It's a compilation. It's not a single piece. It's a compilation of just many pieces from an entire, you know, her time frame, I believe, in the Iberic Peninsula is the 12th to the 15th centuries. So she just looked at, I mean, this is a work that took her probably half a century, right? And she looked at the entire tradition, and she discerned what was most likely to be, you know, like a foreigner in the canon, so to speak, right? Like a seed of orality in the written canon. And it's fantastic because the implications of that kind of work is that it just allows us now to redefine, I guess, concepts of, you know, the metric or what is a verse. I don't know, things can get lost in translation here, but what's the poetic line? These things were pretty much codified But since Margaret published her corpus, I believe that was probably in the, I'm probably going to be wrong here, but it probably in the 90s, I believe that's when it came. I might be wrong about that. I'm really embarrassed because she was my professor. I should know this. But anyway, I mean, we were able to really rethink the entire way we measure poetry, we talk about poetry. But then when you unfold that, you realize that, I guess that should be obvious by now, but it's that all those voices are the voices of those who were actively rejected by the canon. And it ends up being that the majority of those voices are women, right? So it turns out that this oral poetry in Spanish is a female voice. Anyway, and that's just one implication, but there are so many other implications that makes the entire study really valuable, I think. And I was wondering, I've always wondered since I came to the States, if something like that exists in English, but I haven't found it.
I mean, I wish Bob Holman was still around, but not exactly like that. I mean, it does exist, the oral tradition, of course, but it sounds like a remarkable work. I'd love to have access to it. It's beautiful. But of course, the oral tradition exists in all cultures, I'll just say. We know that.
Yeah.
And it's very complicated. I mean, it sounds wonderful.
It is, yeah. Do you read Spanish?
No, I wish I did, but I don't.
Oh, I will send it to you. I have it right here.
Okay.
Thank you. And next we actually have a question from Fong Vui. Fong in the house?
Hi, Joan.
You the mic.
Hi, Joan. Hi, Daisy.
Hi.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I want to make a quick comment and then I go to my short haiku question. A comment about poetry early on and the oral tradition, Joan. We have similar history in Vietnam because, you know, any country that have ravaged by war and political domination, oppression of any kind of form, you learn how to be subversive through poetry because they can't burn your books. You have to memorize the poem and you rewrite the poem and you generate through generations. So I think it's applied to a lot of other cultures. This is one thing that we admire Bob Holman investment, commitment to language matter, where he traveled the rest of the world in where the extinction of those language is dying out. So that's something we know. But I want to make a comment, you know, to Darla and Karen who asked you earlier about the whole idea of narrative, how you create a narrative, and your comment about mythology being created out of fear is exactly how we associate with story from the beginning. and the way that we all know with great certainty is that, especially now, I'm just reading Hannah Arendt's book, edited by a friend of mine who was her executor. The whole book is called, based on her famous phrase, thinking without a banister. And we walk and think and freely while we stepping down or up the stairways without relying on the handrail. And I think that's one thing that we tend to forget, that particularly whether you read a fiction, a story, or a poem, and always go back to the few lines that I remember memorizing from Rumi. Remember Eden poem, John? That famous poem where in the end he say, and even if you eat my poems while they're still fresh, you still have to bring forward many images of yourself. Actually, my friend, what you are eating is your own imagination. These are not just a bunch of old proverbs. And my question now, we heard about Claes, we know a great deal about Jonas, you know, our dear friend, the late Jonas Makers.
Jonas Makers.
Yeah. We know that, your friendship with Jonas, with that whole underground film community. But what about matureness on one hand, Joan, and the other is I'm thinking of Julian Beck and Judith Malina, Living Theater. How does that come into your simultaneous absorbent. It's a time. I mean, I know that it must have been exciting.
I saw the Living Theater, and I knew George. I bought my loft from George, and
bring it up. Yep.
but I wasn't that close to George. I didn't see his performances, but I knew him well. I mean, I used to go to the anthology religiously as much as possible. It was so nearby. I learned everything I know about early film from Jonas's, the anthology film archives and other film theaters in New York. Julian Beck, I wasn't in the theater world, Fung, so I can't say that it was directly, it was wonderful. The Living Theater, I saw a couple of things and they were wonderful, but I was really in the visual arts world. And I was Jack Smith would be a person that I would mention as being important, who was a filmmaker. I hope you all know about Jack Smith. He was a filmmaker, and he did these fantastic performances in his loft. In 1970, I saw them. They started at midnight, and only 10 people came, and you sat on this very rickety scaffolding made of 2x4s that swayed back and forth, and he gave you a smoke beforehand, and then he performed for 4 hours. And that happened every Saturday night for a couple of months. So that to me was what I was drawn to, because I wasn't a theater person. So I can't really say anything other than I have great respect for them. I just want to say that Vietnam, one of the influences on my work is travel. And I was lucky enough to go to Vietnam because I was working with a young artist, Tao, and in this Rolex situation. And so I wanted to visit her. And so that was a period where I was just taking my camera around, recording what interested me. And one of the things that, that I found in Vietnam were these paper constructions. You know about them. They make these elaborate paper animals, which are taken to the ceremony by the mother goddess. You know this, don't you? And then they're burned. And so that to me was an amazing metaphor. And it is in my work a little bit, but not completely. But I'm just mentioning it because you reminded me of it. And I wanted to mention Tao.
Whom I met and had dinner with.
Yeah.
Your love, Joan. Great. Well, thank you so much. There's many other questions, but I think I end mine here, and I will ask this tiny question, Joe, because a lot of people know this, may not know this. You study art history, and you took class with Maya Shapiro, Columbia. Can you say a few words about that?
It was a wonderful, well, I'll just say quickly, it was a wonderful class. Maya Shapiro, it was a class on Impressionism. And you may think, oh, that's, is that the most exciting thing? But it was for me, a formative class, because Maya Shapiro really was developing with all aspects of the culture. And so he related Impressionism to what was happening in science, and the railroads, the steam engine, and that relation of painting to technology, actually. And he was a brilliant lecturer, brilliant. It was just a joy.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Oh, here's the Esther. You have a question?
Hey, I do.
Welcome.
Hello, Joan.
Hi, Theaster.
It's lovely to hear you.
It's lovely. I see your work on Instagram. It's great. Andrea Lisoni sends it out. So I'm glad I can see a little bit of what you're doing.
Oh, thank you, love. This has been so inspiring, Joan. So I just feel like just a wonderful, happy bystander. But I wanted to go back to the question of ritual. I'm reading a book called The Shaker Spiritual by a guy named Daniel Patterson. And the book is basically charting the history of Shaker charismatic activity, okay? But there's a chapter in the book called The Solemn, and they're talking about chants and songs, and there's a set of songs that are referred to as solemn songs. And I want to use this idea of solemn songs to maybe engage you again with this question of the moment. And in moments where I try to resist paying too much attention to the present to force my work to be born,
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like if I had a song in me right now, it would be a very solemn song.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just wanted to ask you about the tone of your films and your performances, and how the tone, the emotional,
Mm-hmm.
how you choose to charge the happy song, the solemn song, the fearful song, the courageous song. Can you talk a little bit about tone in your films?
Wow. Yeah. I think it's a little intuitive. There's somebody blocking you. Somebody named, anyway. Theaster, it's partly intuitive. I enter into my performances. I always say that I make a space and I step into it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't know exactly what's going to happen. Sometimes it's based, and I try to, music is a big influence. I try to play those tones and those songs against each other so that the mood, shifts and changes and keeps a kind of tension. It's very different from what you're talking about, I think. And I don't sing myself. I could say one strong experience was working with Jason because he's a jazz musician. I always work with sound and make an atmosphere by creating sounds. And then when Jason and I are working together, I have all these little objects that I make sounds with. And in a way, he gave me permission to play with that sound with him. And one of my favorite moments of us together is when we get into this incredibly intense, with him it's always intense, but intense duet where the body and the mind and everything is happening all at once. That's just one example.
I love that.
Yeah, and I wish I could do that. I have to get Jason. I hope hello, Jason, if you're there. Yeah. So I don't know. It's a very good question, Theaster, and I'm going to look at that book. I'm curious about.
Thank you so much. The Shaker Spiritual.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Beautiful. It's always wonderful to see the broad community with us today and have artists asking artists. Daisy, Joan, what a gorgeous conversation. I'm so excited to introduce the next portion of today's talk, our poet, Stacy. So we have a tradition at the Rail of ending all of our lunches with a poem. And we carry that into this space by asking our poets to read with us. So Stacy, I'm going to give you a brief intro and hand you over the mic. Stacy Samazek is the author of 6 books, including Famous Hermits, forthcoming in 2021. She directed the Poetry Project at St. Mark's from 2007 to 2018, and most recently was the recipient of a 2009 FCA grant in poetry and visiting Hugo writer at the University of Montana from 2008 to 2019. Stacy, thank you for being with us today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, the Rail team. It's great to be here. And I'm going to be reading sections from a long poem called Famous Hermits, which is the title of my forthcoming book. It's a long poem, about 40 pages. And these are just maybe 6 sections. And I wrote it last summer. Where are places on the edge of disaster and high taxes that have X, Y, and Z? What to do with all this wool? I have played with fat, and perhaps this time in mid-journey lost. Where are places beyond the purview of God-led leaders, lest we be smart as octopi, making daring escapes? It can take 700 years to when pigs fly in the air with their tails forward to be pardoned. Your murder may be solved when pigs fly in the air with their tails forward, and it won't even be called a cold case. Thugs convene daily in public parks, loaded with technology of the era. Let's weaponize, fill in the blank, i.e. infuse everything with the sweet smell of death drive. It can be a rose bush, a kiosk. It can be a nonprofit invisibly steering your movement. Early morning half dream. I blew the dust skulls off of a book of desirable poems in a box of desirable books. Somewhere else, a book is waiting. I drove through the red dust without knowing the time, past a group of women who marched toward the same sundown. Oh, it's eternity. The problem eternally being. Get your laws off my body. Make space with buoyance. You and your lover will always be swept into what people think. Up thrust your word choice, what they think you think based on their mishandling. Hold the space for your lover, a babe in the lake, 3 bodies of water, part of the sky. You are not Chicken Little. You and your lover masquerade as mild people, and no one ever asks you what you think, friends nor creepazoids. Dream. A scene appeared on my forearm in the form of a sleeve, the ink asking for my visual intelligence, a green leafy limb fueled by desire in the trunk. Today I may qualify for Medicaid, unable to predict income for 2020. I talked to 4 people at one store about the whereabouts of an electric kettle. It's a seller's market, suburban. Ancient aquifers are dropping. The diurnal freight train puts me in a less personal mood than the nocturnal train, but it's all conveyance, commerce, sped up to tear up human bodies, hex the owners, shriek one time. The words become something horned and outside barricade. How to lay low in day glow, in blood boil. I don't want to be pained. So I think, hey, I'm like a punk who made a splash. I'm a punk who was a flash. I'm a punk, I have a pan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Daisy, Joan, it's been such a pleasure. I feel we've all started our week off correctly. We do hold these. It's lasted so well through the whole talk. He knows it's over.
He's saying hello.
We do host these events every day. So come back and join us any day at 1 p.m. All the info is on our event site.
Okay.
And if folks would like to turn their mics on to say goodbye, bark goodbye too, you're welcome to.
Thank you so much, Daisy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Daisy.
Thank you.
Stacy, amazing reading.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Stacy.
Bye. Thank you for all your wonderful questions.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hello to Mexico.
Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Jeff.
Andrew, Lynn, Susan.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
It's our great pleasure.
Thank you, Joan.
See you on Instagram.
Ann. Here's Ann from Mexico City.
Yes, I'm in Mexico City with my granddaughter.
Oh my God, Anne. Hi, Anne. Welcome. Hi.
To see you. And
It's wonderful to see you.
First,
My dog is barking. I can't hear. I'll write you, Anne.
okay.
Bye, Ann.
Off to everybody.
Bye, Joan. Bye.